Right, I think we're going to get started. Thank you, Alexa, for the launch party vibes, and hello and welcome everyone to today's Let's Talk conversation and launch of the Power and Potential of Youth Organizing report. My name is Lindsey Barrett, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm a partnership manager on the ground building team at the Skillman Foundation, and I lead our youth power strategy toward equitable education. I want to first thank each and every one of you for being here. We are glad to be having this conversation with you about youth organizing, and we want to know a little bit about who you are. We see some familiar names and faces in the chat and also some new friends and faces. So go ahead and answer those questions in the chat. And we also invite you to join us on camera today if you're able to and if that feels comfortable for you. And we're going to jump right in. So in our work at the Skillman Foundation, our youth power work at the Skillman Foundation, we are partnering with young people to ensure that they are the designers of education systems change and that they have a leading voice and leading role where systems level decisions are made, like public policy. Young people know best the ways that our education system is and isn't working for them, right? They're living it every day. And that means that young people are best positioned to reimagine an education system that effectively meets their needs. And we've been watching young people at the Skillman Foundation in Detroit and around the region who are leading systems change in this way, from the 2018 March for Our Lives to the summer 2020 uprisings for racial justice and to record youth voter turnout in Michigan in the 2022 election cycle. It is clear young people are showing up and leading change. And at the Skillman Foundation, we wanted to know more about this. Who are these young people? What are the issues that are most important to them and that they care about in this moment? And what are the strategies that they're using to make sure their voice is heard and that their ideas are implemented? So last year, we engaged the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing to conduct a scan of youth organizing in Southeast Michigan. And we also engaged an advisory of youth and adults representing 12 local organizations who reviewed the scan and then developed their own set of recommendations that are grounded by their lived experience. And so today, what we're going to do is share a brief preview of the report that will be launched at the very end of the conversation that you'll be able to dig into in more detail. We'll also hear from two powerful youth organizers and the facilitator of the local advisory, who I'll introduce in just a few minutes. And then we'll also have some room and time for questions and discussion. So as we go through the preview and the panel, we ask that you hold on to those questions, or you might want to drop them in the chat, and then we'll invite you into the conversation towards the end of our Let's Talk. And then immediately following the Let's Talk, the big moment, the Youth Organizing Landscape Scan is going to be available on our website. And I have to say, it's a very juicy report. It includes national trends on youth organizing, an analysis of the youth organizing field in Southeast Michigan, which includes strengths and opportunities for growth in the field. It includes recommendations for how philanthropy can support a strong youth organizing ecosystem in Detroit and the region. And it also includes those recommendations that were developed by the local advisory council. So with that, let's go ahead and review a few of the highlights from the report that were informed by a series of surveys and interviews with 20 youth serving organizations in Southeast Michigan. So here's what we found. The top 3 issues that young people are organizing around in the region are racial justice, education, and health. And while these are the top 3 issues, we know that young people are intentionally organizing across issue areas and taking intersectional approaches to address issues like housing, environmental and climate justice, and LGBTQ justice. And this intersectional approach really highlights the awareness of and the real ways that young people experience interconnected systems. We also found that half of the organizations represented in the scan are working exclusively in Detroit, and that there's also representation from youth organizers working regionally and statewide. And so this was both a strength and an opportunity for growth for the field. So there are groups who are working locally in really deep ways. And there are also groups that are focusing on statewide coalitioning. And what we found from the SCAN analysis and also from what we heard from the local advisory is that there's really an opportunity to foster even greater connection and alignment to bridge divides with youth organizers across the state. And if we zoom out, we see that the Midwest holds approximately 10% of these U.S. youth organizing groups. And philanthropic funding is also distributed in similar ways, which means that it leaves some regions under-resourced. And so the headline here is that we know youth organizing groups rely heavily on foundation funding and that there are untapped resources, both locally and nationally, that can support the growth of Michigan's youth organizing landscape. And there's a deeper analysis on this that's available through the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing through their 2020 Funder Scan and their Youth Organizing Field Scan, which we will link in the chat for you in case you're interested in checking that out. And then finally, we learned that groups that are exclusively engaging in youth organizing tend to have smaller org budgets. So half of the groups that were surveyed in the landscape scan have an overall budget of under $500,000. And so we are seeing people, young people, youth organizers demonstrating real impact in Detroit, in the region, in the state. And we also know that to be able to grow and sustain the strengths of the field, that we really need to adequately resource youth organizing. And so these are just a few highlights, and we have gained so many valuable insights and learned so much about the field through the landscape scan and the analysis of those findings. And we know that one of the best ways to learn about the field will always be by listening to young people and the adult supporters who are doing the work. So we're going to do just that now, and I would like you all to please join me in welcoming our three panelists today. Evamelo Oleita, who was an advisory council member for the Landscape Scan and is also a member of the Skillman Foundation's President's Youth Council. Welcome Wallyaldeen Alhomaidi, who is also a youth organizer and a current member of the Skillman Foundation's President's Youth Council. And then finally, our extraordinary advisory council facilitator and community change maker. Please welcome Akua Hill. Hey, y'all. Yeah, give our panel some shine and hand claps in the chat, reactions. All right, so we're gonna dive in, and hi, Eva. We're gonna start with you first. So for those of y'all who haven't had the pleasure yet of meeting Eva, you're gonna meet her now, but she is a youth organizer and also co-founded a youth organizing organization in high school. So Eva, go ahead and tell us a little bit about your org and your youth organizing journey.
Hey, hi everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Okay, so about BLMIC, Black Lives Matter in All Capacities. We were an org that was started when I was 17 and my co-founder, Amma Russell, was 16. And we kind of got started in June of 2020 during like the uprisings because of the George Floyd protests. And during that time, I was feeling really hopeless. I felt really down, and I felt myself almost becoming really pessimistic about the world and just not knowing what my role was or what I could do. And I don't know what happened or what the call to action was for me, but I just really felt motivated to bring people like me, so Black women and girls, into these spaces and to just let our stories be uplifted and heard. And this was really because I was kind of seeing a pattern that was happening back in 2014 with the Mike Brown protest in Ferguson, which was where we were seeing a lot of people only talking about Black men, which is not necessarily an issue, but also understanding that the Black community is not a monolith and that there are so many other issues that are really affecting us that also need to be uplifted, and we cannot necessarily just highlight one. And so I reached out to DAM, Detroit Area Youth Uniting Michigan, who is doing such wonderful work currently. And I didn't really know anything about social justice or organizing in general. And I knew that they were going to be a great support. And that's when I met Amma. And me and Amma went to school together, but it was just that we hadn't really organized together or really just knew anything about each other. But I think one important thing to know is just about sisterhood between Black girls. And despite us not knowing each other, just still feeling really connected and understanding our experiences and just wanting and having this call to action. So in June, we planned to Say Her Name protest just so we could kind of bring the voices and the stories of Black girls into Detroit and just letting people kind of know that we are also a group of people that has been really affected. And the only people talking about our stories are people who look like us and who have the same amount of stake that we do. So we had the protest and it was amazing. Did not expect so many people to show up. I don't know how so many people showed up, but it was great. And it felt really great to just know that people also cared. And I think that's kind of what kept me so hopeful throughout 2020, honestly. And after our protest, we didn't necessarily know what our next step was going to be. We weren't even an organization at this point. We were just two girls who had planned this protest and we felt energized and we were kind of living on this high. We didn't know what to do. And that's when we heard about Grace. And if you didn't know, Grace was a 15-year-old Black girl who was detained in Pontiac, Michigan for not completing her homework during the pandemic. And Amma and I saw so much of ourselves in Grace. And as someone who has also experienced push out with being suspended a lot throughout school, so starting from middle school, and just understanding how early the system attacks Black girls, we knew we kind of had to step in and protect her and kind of hold her in community with us. So we planned two direct actions. One was a sit out at the courthouse where Grace was detained, and then another one was an overnight occupation outside the detention center, which was really scary because at 17 years old, there was all of this talk about being arrested and police presence and just, trespassing and not necessarily knowing what to do. But we were able to successfully help in Grace's release. And she was actually released the following morning after our overnight occupation. And I don't necessarily know what role we played in that, but I am thankful that we were able to have even the smallest of say in her release and just understanding that we were able to kind of hold and protect her. Because even when we were planning the overnight occupation, it wasn't necessarily us to fight for her release, but just for Grace to understand that people who look like you are here. You are not alone. You have the support that you need. And that's kind of how we got started. And from there, we started doing a lot of work with a lot of national organizations around push out and the criminalization of Black girls in schools. And yeah, that was it.
So powerful. Thank you, Eva, for sharing your journey with us to get us started. All right, Wally. So your organizing journey really started right in your neighborhood, in your community, and then really expanded from there. So go ahead and share a little bit about kind of how you've gotten started or how you got started locally, and then where the journey took you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wally. So with my community organizing, I feel like I started organizing because when I first started seeing like the issues that were important to me within my school, I first started with like a local organization and a local program called GENON that worked with youth in my community. And we did other things that involved like not just youth organizing, but also like youth development. But within like GENON, me and like other students from my school had like a few things that we were passionate about, like that we thought like weren't really seen in our school. Like we thought that there were like a lot of resources that were missing. We felt like that there was like not enough funding for certain things that we cared about. So we began this process by creating a survey and surveying students within my school. Then we facilitated town hall with our community where other parents and community members attended. And then later on, we made demands together, and we went to the local school board of trustees, and we like spoke with them and hoped to get some of those demands resolved. And then after that journey, I realized that like while like working in local organizations are very important, like it wasn't enough of what I wanted to do. I wanted to expand more and work with organizations that worked across the state. So I joined 4 to Forward, and with 4 to Forward, I've done actions that help make an impact across the state, like going to Lansing and attending lobbying and marches, so I can make an impact across the state.
Thank you, both Wally and Eva, for just sharing the power of the collective voice of young people, and advocating, representing what matters to you and advocating together, and how that can really impact and influence change. So Akua, you were the facilitator for the local advisory council. Easy task, right? But you did an incredible job of facilitating young people and adults across 12 organizations. And so would love for you to just share a little bit about what that process was like, what process that the council followed, and then what were some things that, stood out to you about the field just from facilitating that process?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsey. Hi, everyone. So this process, I would say everyone involved would agree, many lessons learned, and also some really beautiful things that came out of the process, some of which you'll be able to read about in the report. But it was also really challenging. Collaborative work is very challenging. And then if you add the layers of inequity and just cross-sectional issues that we're all facing, many who were in the group directly dealing with the realities of many of the issues that we were talking about, it made for a very rich experience. So I'll share a little bit about that. Our group, as Lindsey mentioned, had representatives from 12 youth serving organizations across the region, many of them who do youth organizing, but some who do youth development and are interested in getting into youth organizing work. So we met monthly for a span of 6 months over 2022 and earlier this year. It was a multicultural and intergenerational group, which was really important to us. And really a bulk of our time was spent not just coming up with the recommendations, but building trust and relationships, which we all know is super important to this work, both between young people and their peers, between young people and adults, and then between the different adults representing the youth serving organizations. So there was a lot of layers of trust building that needed to happen, which we realized very quickly. And so we almost had to kind of shift gears a little bit and adjust our timeline. Many of you who work with youth or work in community spaces know that you don't always, well, most of the time, you're not always sticking to the plan as precisely, I guess, as you laid it out. And so we did have to be flexible and realize that we actually, in order to make this a meaningful process, we needed to pump the brakes and really spend time on the trust and relationship building piece, which we did. We also spent some time examining the history of youth organizing in our region and really honoring the fact that this is not new work, particularly when we look at Detroit. We have beautiful examples from our past where we've seen the power of youth organizing, to name a few: Detroit Summer, the Detroit Future Youth Network, the James and Grace Lee Boggs School. So just to name a few, but really recognizing that we're not creating new things. Yes, we may be in a new time and need to examine new strategies, but it's also equally important for us to acknowledge the roots in which this work has been born. And so we spent time doing that, and then really moved into this space of examining the current realities and needs of the groups around the table, and then building a set of recommendations to strengthen the youth organizing landscape in the region. So it may seem like 6 months is a lot of time to do that. It went so fast. And with our adjustments, really required the group to commit to making sure that we reached our deliverable at the end, because we knew that this was going to be a really important report to share with our peers, with other funders, et cetera. And so I'm just really honored to have worked with the group. We worked through a lot of challenges and came up with some really great recommendations for the field. Some of the things that stood out to me from our time together, I already talked a little bit about the need for explicit trust and relationship building, not it being like an afterthought, or hopefully that happens along the way, but really being intentional about it. A lot of the groups were familiar with each other, but had not necessarily collaborated to this extent. And so, yeah, that piece was really, really foundational. A lot of the organizations expressed that they didn't have space. Some of the organizations around the table did, but many did not. And so that came up as a very kind of like shared need across the board, to just have space for young people to come together, not just for organizing, but to be with one another, to have safe space, maybe to do work or just to socialize. And then a couple of other things I think we realized along the way was that a lot of the organizations around the table had different organizing philosophies. And so we had to spend time kind of really digging in and saying, like, what is organizing? What is your approach to organizing? And where do we intersect and where do we differ? And, you know, collaborative work is not about everybody being the same or getting everyone to agree on the same thing. So how do we honor those differences, but still figure out where we can work together to strengthen this field? And then the last thing I'll say that really stood out was that a lot of organizations, whether it was the youth or the adults perspective, did not feel that currently youth organizing is a sustainable career path for people, whether it's a young person organizing or whether it's adults who are working with young people who are organizing. And so for me, and you know, in the context of this larger conversation with funders, thinking through how do we not just strengthen the field in a way that is about quantitative results and like how many young people can you activate and things like that, but what does the sustainability of this pathway look like? How are we building a pipeline for folks to say, if I choose to be a youth organizer in Southeast Michigan, I feel like this is a place where I can grow, where I can be a leader, where I can be financially secure and, you know, support my life. And so I would say those are some of the big things that stood out from our time together and kind of really taking a deep dive into what youth organizing looks like in Southeast Michigan.
Awesome. Thank you, Akua, for that and for your incredible facilitation of that group. And thank you to the advisory council. I see some of you on the call, so just shout out to you and thanks for all the work that you've done, and thank you too just for elevating the critical resource that our relationships are in this work, and what's required to build trust and collaboration, and how that, you know, is critical to sustain the work for the long term. Speaking of resources, Eva, I mentioned earlier that youth organizing groups do rely a lot on foundation funding to sustain the work. And we know that fundraising is it is time and labor intensive, and that can be especially true for young people who have busy schedules, who have, you know, competing priorities and are often uncompensated for that work, right? And so can you just talk to us a little bit about your experience as an organizer, as an organization, a leader of an organization, and what that experience fundraising was like for you, and what are some considerations or things that funders should be thinking about to equitably and holistically support youth organizers?
Great question, first of all. But when we were starting with BLMIC, we had no money at all. And we relied a lot on crowdfunding and on our community to just really support us and to kind of just give us some funds. And it really wasn't until Brittany Cooper, who was another Black woman, but she's not from Detroit. She doesn't have any stake here, but she posted us on her Instagram and she had a really great following. And from there, money started flowing in and we received thousands of dollars, honestly. And that money went to such great use, but we didn't have any money afterwards. And we didn't have consistent money coming in, honestly. And at the time, both Amma and I were working, and we were not paying ourselves with the money that we received because it just didn't really feel right to us. And we wanted to make sure that all of the funding that we had received, all of the money that people gave us, were going back directly into our work. And it really wasn't until we started working with this group in New York, Girls for Gender Equity, GGE, that we started being paid. And it was a lot because it felt like a weight lifted off of my shoulder almost. Like somebody is actually understanding that this work, I need to get paid for this work because I'm in school. I'm working other jobs just to survive and get through this, especially during the pandemic. And I think one of the things to know about GGE is that this is an org ran by women of color and predominantly Black women. So still understanding the whole aspect of only being centered in work by Black women and girls is really important. I would say as for funding suggestions, you know what? No, I'm going to backtrack. Applying for grants when you are young is really, really hard because there is an extra layer of risk that some foundations typically have because we're so young and because we're not a 501c3 and we have like fiscal sponsorships, but this work is important. And just because we're young doesn't mean that we can't put this money to use. And quick shout out to Skillman because y'all were one of the first orgs to really just give us a grant that we felt we could actually use to do this work. And we're going to be having a wellness event for Black girls at the end of July. So be posted. But it's hard because at the time when we started, we were under 18 and we knew nothing about grant making. We knew nothing about any type of finances or anything like that. So it was just really difficult. And we didn't really know how to apply for grants, how to look for grants, but it's been a learning process. And as we've gotten older, it's been easier, but we still have that risk of we're so new and we're in college. So there's another layer of how do we organize within our community when we're also trying to organize at school. And I would say I have 3 suggestions for foundations that are looking to fund youth organizing. 1, do you have youth in the room with you when you are looking to allocate these funds? And that's another thing that Skillman does well with our President's Youth Council is bringing young people into these rooms to make sure that this money is going into the right pockets. 2, do you have stake in this? So are you also a part of this community, or are you going to be funding orgs that are just coming in from the outside and thinking that they're doing this work, but they're not? I would also say 3 is making sure, kind of like when I said, making sure you have young people in this work. But if you have a grant that is supposed to serve queer people, for example, so the queer community, do you have people at that table who can also advocate for them? Because you can't have a table full of white people, okay, for example, trying to give money to the Black community, but they're not in that community. They don't exactly know what we need. So sometimes even when they put certain restrictions on grants, we can't even use the grants, or we can't apply for the grants because we don't meet their criteria. And I think another thing that sometimes foundations don't understand is just that just because you don't think an issue is important does not mean it's not important to someone. All of these, we are not fighting for things that are not important. We're not wasting our time. We're not going out into these streets where we have the potential to be harmed just because we want to do it. But we're doing this work because we really want to make a difference. And we want to make sure that people like us are being heard and are being uplifted. So, yeah.
Ooh, snaps, mic drops, period. Eva said it all. I mean, you are raising really important questions, Eva, for philanthropy, even in terms of how does philanthropy assess risk? Whose work is risky or worth investing in or not, and who is being invested in? And this is really the beauty of having young people here with us today, having young people on the advisory council, because it really helps to bring life to the recommendations that are in the report that you all will read soon. So I just want you to hold on to these stories and lived experience that our panel are sharing today. And Akua, because of the time that you spent with the council and hearing those stories and kind of knowing the nuances underneath those recommendations that might not be immediately apparent, are there other recommendations or nuances that you wanted to draw out from the recommendations for folks to be looking for when they dig into the report later on today?
Sure, yeah. So there are lots of really good recommendations in the report, and I want to lift up two two sections that kind of came up through our process. One, we started kind of developing a section of recommendations that were more around like recognizing people's humanity and seeing, you know, the basic needs of folks before asking them to show up and do work. And we were going to have this be its own section, but really where we landed was that all of the recommendations should be grounded in those values of equity and humanness. And so what that looks like is, particularly for funders, is reassessing some of the grant making practices, metrics and cycles that are currently in use. One thing that came up repeatedly, and that actually a lot of organizations are already doing, but with really tight funds, is having a mutual aid fund or an emergency fund for the young people that they work with. The reason why this is so critical, as with all of us, but if you are not able to address or meet your basic needs, and then someone is asking you to show up, and, you know, organizing is not easy work. And as I mentioned earlier, the issues that we're addressing, many of us are dealing with on a daily basis. So there is this dual kind of way that we're being asked to show up. And yet there's not always resources to address the basic needs of the young people that are at the front lines of this work. And so that's one way that the group felt, you know, funders could be really thinking more intentionally about the whole person and not just the outcomes that they would like to see through the funding. Another way that folks were kind of calling for funders to reassess their practices was just taking a look at how often adult grants are larger sizes than youth grants or work that is youth-centered. Those grants tend to be a lot smaller. And so folks were just lifting up the point that in a time where we're asking for or demanding more equity across the board, that we need to take a look at this as well. Why are we saying that youth work is less valuable than adult-centered work? Anybody on the call that works with young people or does really or you know, uses grant money to sustain their work, a lot of the folks felt that we needed to see more multi-year grants. You can't build up momentum and you can't build power in 1 year. And so if we are really trying to build this for the long run in a sustainable way, going back to what I said earlier, creating a career path that feels supportive of a full life, those type of things require that folks are not only just asked to show up and do all of this work, pour all this work in 1 year, and then they're not able to kind of trust that those resources are going to be available the following year. That creates more stress, more anxiety, and really takes away from folks being able to be present and do the work itself. And then the last thing I'll say, you know, we talked a lot about how sometimes across the board, you know, when we're writing grant reports or when we're talking about the metrics for a specific initiative, it does feel very quantitative heavy. And we're asked to, you know, share on how many young people we've activated or how many young people we've served. And so sometimes that can cause us to focus a lot more on wide reach. So how many young people have you touched? And what everyone around the table said is that there needs to be more of a focus on deep youth engagement. And so just to reiterate that, rather than saying like, how many young people can we engage? How are we building deeper relationships with the young people that we are working with? How are we wrapping around them to support their basic needs? How are we creating a pathway where they feel like they can continue to grow as leaders, as decision makers in the work and actually want to stay in the work? So I think that one is really, really important. So I'll end on that note, but definitely this idea that, you know, we want to see value placed on deep youth engagement as opposed to wide youth engagement.
Thank you, Akua. And Molly, I want to stick on this point a little bit about leadership pathways that Akua has talked about a couple of times. In your work, you've held actually formal leadership roles and decision-making roles in these intergenerational organizing groups. And I was hoping that you could share a little bit about both what prepared you and supported you in those leadership roles, but then also what was the work that you saw being done within those organizations, with the adults in those organizations, so that they could also be ready to be in good partnership with you in those roles.
Yeah, thank you. And to answer your question, I'm going to be like talking about the things that organizations did that I felt like worked well when it comes to preparing me for my role. So like the first thing that I want to talk about is how organizations that allowed the youth themselves to fight for issues they were passionate about, and not just like issues the adults in the space thought they were passionate about. And organizations that were youth-led, not just in name, but also allowed the youth to impact or make decisions. And then organizations that had a more diverse group of grassroots organizers that helped keeping like similar to what my other panelists were saying about how certain people who fight for an issue, if they are not a part of, or if they're not within the community that is experiencing the issues, they might not know how to support the specific issue itself. So having a diverse group allows for a diverse space of ideas. And then lastly, I felt like organizations that provided compensation, as like my other panelists were saying, or support for the youth when it comes to things like transportation or food. I put this as like the most critical for what supported me for my role, because when I was joining all of these organizations at a young age, I did not have the transportation. I did not have, I had to rely on like the compensation for food. And because of course, coming from a low income family household, that was not something that I had the privilege of. So that helped a lot. And I feel like that is something that is very important for preparing the youth in those roles.
Thank you, Wally. I really appreciate you driving home what we've heard so much from the advisory council and from youth organizers, the importance of transportation, compensating young people for the work that they're doing, and thinking about, as Akua said, how do we really support young people in their leadership to make sure their needs are met and really show up and do the hard work of organizing. There is so much more that we could dig into today with all of you, but I do want to make sure that we leave a little bit of time for some discussion and Q&A with all the folks that have joined us today. So as a reminder, at the end of this session, we're going to release the report. We'll be putting the link in the website. Folks are going to be digging into all of the meat inside of the report. And so just closing out, what final thoughts that do you all have around how philanthropy, knowing that the report shares a lot of recommendations, the advisory council shared a lot of recommendations about how philanthropy can support youth organizers. What do you want to leave us with in terms of any final thoughts around that, or just generally what kinds of things will support the youth organizing field? And
I
want to go first.
Okay. I think first I'll say engaging young people in grant making. So with our recommendations, not only should you read them, but you should also work to apply them to your groups, to your orgs, share them out, because a lot of what we talked about came directly from young people's mouths. Like lack of transportation is something that we already know just affects our city in general and just Southeast Michigan, but Michigan as a whole. And I also think compensating young people for the work that we do. When you go to school full time, when you're working other jobs, when you're doing exams, you're taking care of your family, it's hard to also support your community in the ways that you want to. We cannot do this work for free, no matter how much we want to. And we do want to do this work, but it's really hard to just balance all of these things when you're not getting paid. And it's hard to prioritize certain things because you might be getting paid somewhere else. I think one thing I'll also like to add, and it's similar to what Akua was saying earlier, but about relationship building and adultism. You can have a youth org, but you might not really be serving young people. You might say you are, but if you're not listening to the young people who are within your organization, and if you're not even listening, but also applying everything that they're saying and making sure that you're making an effort to build these relationships, to address your adultism, and to also just to address the power dynamics, because we know it's something that happens, but I think too often people kind of steer away from that off of fear. And it's okay to address the fact that you're an older person in this space and you don't know as much as us.
I can go next, I guess. But for me, the thing that I wanted to mention was nothing about us without us, because making sure that like the space represents people within the community, I feel like is one of the most important things.
What I would say is, and pretty much I echo what Wally and Eva both said, building a little bit on what Eva said. From an adult perspective, I think it's important for us to recognize that the onus is on adults to actually make space for young people, to lead, to make decisions. And so we can't, it's not, it's not enough to just say, oh, we're going to invite one young person to sit on this board, or we're going to invite one young person to be a part of this initiative so that we can say we had youth engagement or youth involvement. And we have many groups in our region that are, I think, championing what youth-led decision-making looks like. We also have some folks who are misunderstanding what that means, or like Eva said, who are talking the talk and not walking the walk. But it is our responsibility to not just say we have young people a part of this, but to address our own adultism, to make sure that the spaces that we're inviting them into are safe for them. And I don't mean just in like a fluffy way, but like adults can do harm toward young people by saying like, we want you to be here, but then we're not listening to what they have to say, or we're asking them to generate all these ideas and then we don't implement any of them. That's really, really harmful. And then we want them to stay in this work and do it for free and for the long term. Like there's just so much backwards around it. So yes, I will lift up again what Eva says, like young people need to be compensated equitably for their work, for their time, for their energy. And also the responsibility is on adults to make sure that the spaces that we're inviting them into are actually prepared to hold them and support them and honor them, and respect them as the leaders and as the experts that they are in this work. And so that requires more time and intentionality on our end. So I would say anybody that is feeling inspired to start engaging more young people in your work, don't just send out an email tomorrow. Like take some time to be deeply reflective on what you're asking them to show up to and what you are also compensating them for in response to that. Sorry, I can't think of the right word. And then also like, is the space actually prepared for them? So that's what I would leave with.
Eva, Wally, Akua, thank you. Thank all of you. Thank you for your stories today, getting to know all of you over the last few weeks and months. I've learned that you are all truth tellers. And so just thank you for bringing your truth to this conversation today. And if the folks who are in the room with us can also show the panel some love, that would be awesome. And then we're going to open it up. So I'm sure what Eva, Wally, and Akua have shared today have brought up some questions or curiosities or just thinking that you want to share. And so as you saw, we invite you to drop your questions in the chat or go ahead and raise your hand. Let me pull up participants list so I can see hands. Yeah, and we'd love to bring you into the conversation. Panel, you're getting lots of love in the chat if you haven't seen it. All right, and it looks like we have a question from Maria. Maria, come on off mute. Hey, Maria, it's good to see you here. Maria, if you're talking, you're still on mute. And that was Maria Salinas, but it looks like we also have a question from Maria Franklin. So Maria Franklin, go ahead and jump in, and then Maria Salinas will come back to you.
Hi, everybody. So well done, everyone. Great job. It was really nice to hear the work that you've been everything you've been working on over the past few months. And I guess I had a question about the transportation piece, because that is something that is coming up, and it's something that, you know, I'm thinking about how do we address it, and what would you say is an adequate way to address transportation issues for youth, in terms of like a long-term solution? I guess, well, how would you respond to that? And what's been most helpful for you in terms of addressing your transportation needs? And I'm just asking from a lens of for other organizations that want to build that into their budgets or think through what that should look like and how it can be most effective to be able to apply it.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Maria. And as I'm sure is the case for you, like we spend so much time talking about transportation as one of the top challenges to working with young people. So yes, agreed. And I think it's like $1 million, probably multi-million-dollar question that so many groups have been grappling with for so long. I think the reality of it, to start off, is that it is rooted in a larger infrastructure challenge. And so it's like, yes, what we've seen is lots of organizations that have done kind of what they can to try and, I won't say band-aid the issue, but at least to make sure that their young people can get where they need to go. However, it's not really addressing the issue at the root. But I think, yeah, most youth groups are figuring out, they're either picking up young people themselves. One thing that I do know I've seen in the past few years is sometimes you will build into your budget in a grant transportation line, so that either you give money directly to the young people to be able to get where they need to go, or you are making sure that transportation is provided for them with that money. So that's one way that I think, rather than putting the onus on the organization to figuring that out every time, being kind of like proactive in the beginning and actually building that into the budget. But not all funders will approve of transportation budget. So that is also something that we can be thinking about on a larger scale as well. But I wish I had an answer for you. I think it's something that we're all grappling with. I think one out of the advisory council, one thing that everybody was very clear on is that we didn't want to see a privatized solution to it. So, I think that one of the ideas that came up that was really genius is like actually pay a group of young people to come up with solutions for this. To Wally's point, nothing about us without us. So we don't need to come up with those solutions on our own, but it definitely will take time, like I said, because it is a larger infrastructure issue. So sorry, I don't have a better solution.
Thank you, Akua. I'm gonna toss it over now to Maria Salinas to make sure we get you in here, and then we may have time for one more, and I will also put my contact info in the chat so that if we're not able to address every question today, we'll be able to get in touch.
Yeah, well, kudos to the panel. They're amazing. I just want to make sure we uplift. We've come a long way with our youth voice and value. And, we got to make sure that we are celebrating our successes. We have, I remember there wasn't conversations like this 10 years ago. The Skillman Foundation is the pioneer under the Good Neighborhood Initiative 17 years ago, kind of started a lot of us organizing youth councils and things like that. And yeah, I think unrestricted money and actually writing these specific things into the grant, making sure we're writing for incentives for young people, because we can't expect young people to do things without getting paid. Bottom line, We're changing that whole culture. It's working. You can write it right into your grants, and also transportation being progressive and innovative. We got Uber and Lyft. There's different things you can do, and funders are starting to get more into understanding without youth. They're the ones that are going to change the systems that we've been struggling with. And there's a lot of organization. There's a national and global organization that's happening, all led by young people. So kudos to Skillman, number one, that I feel was a pioneer in starting a lot of this 17 years ago. And we are seeing some of the strides. Currently, we have a youth-driven community house in Southwest Detroit. We need more of that. You know, we got to give value to the young people because they're the ones that are going to change everything.
Thank you, Maria. We do have a question I'm seeing from Capturing Belief, Romaine, I think it is. And did you want to come off mute and ask your question, or would you like me to jump in? And I think this is one that everyone on the call, including our panel, can drop some recommendations in the chat. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Romaine said jump in, yeah.
Romaine said, thank you everyone for sharing your experience in youth organizing. Looking forward to studying the report. Outside of your own organization, what organization shall we look at as leading examples with youth created and youth-led programming? And do you consider fair financial compensation, and what do you consider fair financial compensation for youth workers? Good question. If folks on the call have examples that you want to shout out in the chat, Maria kind of got us started, but back to our panel. I think the question is examples of organizations with young people leading programming, and then what do you consider fair compensation for youth-led work?
I feel like that's a question for young people, so I'm not going to answer that. What do y'all think?
Yeah, like from the audience wanted to answer. I would say from two orgs that I've worked with before, DAM, which I already gave a shout out to, but they've been doing great work since the March for Our Lives movement, and then also YVAC, Young Voices Action Collective, I think that's what it is. But YVAC has been doing such phenomenal work. They do a lot of mutual aid work and a lot of emergency based work for young people in the city and also around the nation. They have a chapter in Philadelphia as well, but just been doing really great work. And I know right now they're working on a freedom transit movement, which is addressing transportation. But also I would say, what does fair compensation look like? I think it looks different for different types of work. I think that's a conversation that you would honestly have to have with the young people that you're trying to service or bring into, because how we get paid looks differently for each service that we provide, I guess. You can't really just give a base or like a flat rate for youth organizing. I think it depends on how much work we're doing, how much funding we have. And yeah, just having a conversation with the young people that you're trying to service would probably be a better answer for you.
Just to piggyback, I completely agree with what Ava's saying, because what I was going to say was something along similar lines of each specific work that youth are doing. I feel like can see a different fair financial compensation. So like talking with the youth that you're working with, I feel like is the best way to get that answer.
If I could just add really quickly, another nuanced thing that came up in our conversations is that it also matters the method in which you're paying young people. So sometimes adult-led organizations tend to lean on like gift cards, Visa gift cards, or online things. And those are not always what young people want to receive. So also thinking about the actual method that you're using to pay young people, a lot of them do not want gift cards. So I agree with both comments, like have that conversation with them.
Oh my gosh, one more thing. Big up to the no gift cards. I totally agree. But then also make sure to maybe have conversations about alternatives to monetary compensation. There are a lot of things that we struggle with as young people, and sometimes just giving us direct checks might not necessarily be what we need within that moment.
So we are coming up on time. And I just want to thank the panel again. This has been an incredible conversation. And thank everyone who's joined us today. And this is the beginning, and we have reached the moment now where we are going to ask you to go and download the report. There'll be a link that's dropped in the chat in just a moment. And it's also up there on the screen. Eva said, we want to do the work, and Akua reminded us too that the onus is on us as adults. And so the task now, this is just the beginning. Please go download the report, bookmark it, read it, spend some time with it, think through it, as Akua said, get reflective, and then get ready for what's possible when we get behind the power of young people. And thank you again, Eva, Wally, and Akua for joining us. And thank you all.